Hey everyone, I'm Brian. This is Voice in the Wilderness, and today we're going to dig deep into the subject that many Australians, and many around the world actually, are feeling deep in their wallets and in their homes. The promise of cheaper power from renewables. We'll look under the hood of the so-called net zero transition, and we'll ask the sort of tough questions and examine whether what we're being told by the experts, the government and the media, whether the renewables would make cheaper power is holding up in the real world, or is it just subterfuge? Are they lying to us like they usually do? Now, we'll also revisit the case for coal-fired baseload power as a stable and cheap foundation, like it always has been. And we'll dive into the in-depth processes of building and finally disposing of solar farms and wind farms, what to do with those solar panels and those wind generators when their time's up, when they're past their use-by date. So if you're concerned about your electricity bill, about what's happening in regional Australia, or about the long-term wisdom of how we build a sustainable but affordable energy system, you'll want to stay with me and watch the rest of this video. Okay, so let's start with the promise. Governments, energy companies, and many in the renewables industry, and I must say there are a lot of politicians who have shares or stocks in those renewable industries, and that's why, one of the reasons why they push it so much. But they're telling us more wind, more solar, more renewables equals cheaper electricity for households and businesses. Now that was a compelling promise. Everyone stood up and listened to that. But what's the reality? We're not seeing that today. Energy prices have risen. People are being forced onto the streets because of the costs, like that for energy, are rising so much. Okay, so here's some of the facts. While the cost of generating electricity from wind and solar on a purely theoretical basis may be falling, the system costs, the transmission, the grid firming, the storage, the backup generation are increasing. We're seeing companies like, I can't remember their name, but they want to build a big, massive battery system outside of Bundaberg, and they say it's for the good of the people. But rubbish. All you'll be doing is buying back the electricity that your solar panels has already created for free. Get your own batteries. Put your own batteries in your place. I've done it. It's brilliant. Now, one analysis points out that the energy transition is a once-in-a-lifetime transformation, which comes with a price tag. A key working paper from the Griffith University tested a counterfactual. What if we had stuck with coal and gas only? What if? We'll never know that because we have jumped up left-wing politicians. But the Griffith University found that yes, renewables may offer lower cost compared to new fossil fuel builds, but that still doesn't mean the entire power bill falls to what we used to pay in the mid-2000s. And meanwhile, for consumers, the dynamics are getting even messier. Older coal plants are aging, they're breaking down, requiring more maintenance. Fuel costs for gas and coal are volatile. Supply chain and interest rates change. Global commodity shocks all cascade into our electricity pricing. But there's also the mismatch between the wholesale cost of generation and the retail consumer bill that we're having to pay, that we're having to foot. Just because the wholesale cost may be lower doesn't mean all the networks, the poles, the wires, the retailer margin and other system costs disappear. We understand all that, but why are the consumers being raped every day in their power bills? Now, the promise of renewables equals cheaper power isn't a simple direct drop in your bill overnight. The transition itself has sort of cost layers involved, timing issues, and system complexity that many bills reflect. Let's talk about how this plays out in Australia. One report shows us that wholesale electricity from renewables in the 24-25 period sat around $74 Australian per megawatt hour, while coal and gas was about $135 Australian per megawatt hour. Now, on the face of it, that seems great. Renewables are cheaper. But the same report then flags the high transmission and network costs are offsetting the benefits of that lower generation cost. While the lower cost of wind and solar generation will be largely offset by the higher costs of transmission for the next few years. Now, looking into it, another source observes that although renewables are lower cost in sense of the new build generation, they still don't reduce our power bills to mid-2000s levels. The wholesale cost of a 50% renewable grid are still much higher than the $40 megawatt hour average spot price observed in the mid-2000s. But on the flip side of that, some in the fossil fuel coal industries argue that coal remains significantly cheaper than what some official modelling assumes for us. For example, one lobby group claims that new coal plants could deliver LCOE, levelised cost of electricity, at $50 to $70 per megawatt hour, far below some government figures. We can't expect the government to tell us the truth, honestly. Now, the bottom line is many households and businesses are feeling the pinch. Rising bills cause real hardship for regional communities, for small businesses, for people on fixed incomes like government pensions and disability pensions, things like that. The energy transition, while arguably cheaper in the long run, has short to medium term complexity and cost burdens that are real, and they're being felt right now by a majority of Australians. Okay, so let's turn to the argument for coal-fired power, baseload power like we used to have. This is where I'll state my strong opinion. Bases matter. Stability matters. Cheap, reliable power matters for families and communities. Why coal-fired baseload gets to the support it does? Because the reliability and the firmness of it. These coal-fired power stations, especially the large ones built for continuous operation, which is the baseload, deliver steady supply and predictable output. That gives the grid a stable backbone, which we're not seeing now with renewables. When you shift to high shares of intermittent solar and wind, you add complexity in grid firming, in storage, and in backup generation. Now, a reliable baseload helps maintain system integrity. Technical research backs this. When a grid becomes dominated by variable resources, the cost of ancillary or essential system services goes way up. Now, many countries, including Australia, already have coal-fired plants, even though ours are being shut down at an alarming rate. So extending their life can be cheaper than building brand new generation from scratch. Just look into what money is going into these wind farms, these solar farms, things like that, especially in the short term. Some industry analysis argues that the existing coal fleet should be leveraged instead of prematurely retiring it. Now, consider the claim by a coal industry body that a new coal plant can generate electricity at $50 to $70 Australian per megawatt hour, compared to higher estimates for newer build integrated renewables. Now, whether those numbers pan out in reality is debated, but the argument is made and resonates with those concerned about the cost and reliability. It resonates with me. I guarantee it resonates with you as well, because you are the ones that are paying the high prices as well, that the government doesn't care about. Now, that brings us to the consumer impact. Because the cost of generation is a fundamental part of what drives power bills. If generation is cheaper and reliable, that could translate into lower bills for us, or at least less upward pressure on our economy, on our bills each week. So the argument is, if we had a strong baseload from coal, like we've always had, we might avoid part of the renewables transition cost that's pushing the bills up. But no, the governments want to shut the coal-fired baseload power stations down and make us rely on that which is unreliable. So my view on this is, I personally believe a wise energy policy should not write off our coal baseload overnight, especially in a country like Australia with abundant coal resources that we're selling off to other countries like China so they can have the cheap power. What about us? What about Australians? Now, with established infrastructure and people in regional communities whose livelihoods depend on that power, but they depend on having less expensive power. Now, a pragmatic transition that keeps coal baseload operational while renewables scale up, it makes sense. But never, we can't rely on renewables on their own unless they want to go the whole hog and put in nuclear power. But in saying that, I also acknowledge the counter arguments, the environmental climate damage, the exposure to global coal fuel price shocks, the long-term financial trade-offs is real. The risk of stranded assets and regulatory policy risks surrounding coal, they're real. The key is consumers and communities must not be left bearing the cost for ideological driven transitions without proper safeguards. Now, another part of the story that often gets less airtime in the public debate, which means you get to hear less about it, is the hidden or less obvious costs in the transition to renewables. Now, these include, but are not limited to, the transmission and network upgrades. To get wind farms or solar farms located in the remote regions in areas not the main cities in Australia and into the main grid often requires new high voltage transmission lines, new substations and new network reinforcements. Now these costs flow through to the consumers, and the governments aren't telling you about that. For example, one analysis said that although the generation cost for renewables is declining, the system also requires new transmission and network upgrades. And that isn't cheap, my friends. That is what is helping to put our bills up. Now, firming up backup power is important because solar and wind are a variable. You need firming capacity, either storage with batteries, pumped hydro, or gas coal backup. I prefer the gas coal backup because we know it works. We know we can rely on it. Now, these other backups ensure when sun doesn't shine or wind doesn't blow, you still have power. These add costs though. Research on essential system services point out that grids with high shares of inverter-based renewables incur extra costs for inertia, for getting that power out, for stability, and etc. Life cycle and replacement risks are that many coal plants were built decades ago under different cost regimes. Many renewable projects are being built now in a more inflationary interest rate high environment, which raises capital costs. One article states what changed supply chain constraints, higher interest rates. The unit cost of onshore wind projects more than doubled over the past 5 years. Now, even if the generation cost is lower, the benefit may only be fully flowing onto the consumers years later. And I know I can't afford that benefit in cost to flow through to me years later. I am suffering high power bills now, as so many are. I work on the streets and I see families that are doing it so hard because of these power prices. In the meantime, consumers may bear the transitional changes, but just bear them. Network upgrade costs or other pass-through items are still causing us high costs. When we ask why aren't power bills lower despite them pushing more renewables out, making a blight on the landscape with these solar farms and these dirty grey windmills that kill birds and everything. These hidden costs are timing issues and they're part of the big answer. Now, I want to look briefly at the construction, the life cycle, and the disposal for these solar farms and wind farm generation aspects. We'll go into an area many in the public don't hear much about. It's the full life cycle of solar and wind farms. Now, that means from construction through operation to the end of life disposal or repowering. Because if we're going to move to a net zero future, which is a stupid idea, we need to ask what happens at the end of these assets. What are the real processes and costs? Now, to construct solar farms or wind farm, building a large-scale solar farm involves land acquisition and lease, which means less farming land.
This drone footage shows the scale of farmer resistance to a renewable energy project in Victoria.
Site preparation, mounting structures and tracking systems, PV module installation, which is photovoltaic module integration, inverter and wiring installation, transmission connection, grid integration, and these are all major capital works that we're paying for. Now, during its lifetime, maintenance, cleaning, inverter replacements, module degradation, panel cleaning, and vegetation management are also something that we are paying for in our power bills, which they're not telling us about. And then when it gets to the end of life or decommissioning these renewables factors, we look to see, and according to a recent Australian analysis, solar farms typically have a lifespan of up to 25 years. Our coal-fired plants were going a lot longer than that before they were shut down by the Greenies. Now, many first-wave solar farms in Australia are approaching that already. Remember that. Most are approaching that 25-year lifespan already. Now, one report also tells us that Australia's solar waste is also a growing concern. Recycling is costly, about $500 to $1,000 per tonne Australian, and many panels still end up in landfill or are being shipped overseas. Australia's first solar panel recycling plant opened in Queensland recently, capable of recycling 240,000 panels per year. But while the generation period may be 20 to 25 years, the end-of-life cost and process isn't trivial. That's why they're not telling us what those costs are. Solar panel recycling, many materials in solar panels like the aluminium, the glass, the copper, the silver are recoverable, but the process is still nascent and often more expensive than the disposal. And you can't just throw these solar panels into the ground because they won't break down. Our wind farms, let's look at the construction and the disposal issues of them. Wind farms are massive turbines. They're on high towers. They've got massive blades. The foundations need to be vast for them for each and every one of those towers. They need to have access roads. They need to have grid connection. And farmers are losing their land. Some are doing it willingly, which I can't understand. There's some are doing it at the government's demand. Now, the life expectancy may be 20 to 30 years. Some may be up to 40 years for the onshore towers. But let's not forget they're building them offshore as well. They're polluting the water and the God's green earth with these big towers. Now, the end-of-life process for decommissioning of a wind farm or a wind tower involves dismantling the turbine, removing those massive foundations, often to some depth to allow the land to be used for agriculture again, and then rehabilitating the land. Fortunately for onshore wind, around 85 to I think it's 94% by massive turbine components are recyclable in Australia at the present. The steel towers, the cells, the copper, the aluminium, according to the Clean Energy Council. The problem part, the turbine blades, those massive big fan blades. These are composite materials, fiberglass and carbon fiber, and are difficult and expensive to recycle. One study warns thousands of tons of blade composite waste will accumulate unless recycling pathways multiply. So let's just concentrate on that aluminum. These blades are massive. They're telling us they're doing the country or the earth wonders. They're doing a really good job. But again, it comes back to the expense on our shoulders, because it is expensive to recycle those blades. So, and let's take an example. The oldest commercial wind farm in Australia, which is the Codrington, I think, Codrington Wind Farm, is being shut down because modern repowering isn't viable. And disposal of turbines is part of that consideration. So they're shutting down a wind farm. How soon before they start shutting down all the others, the new ones they're building? The increasing mass of aging wind infrastructure means disposal costs, or the recycling costs, will increasingly matter. And these costs are often not front of mind in public discussion. The politicians certainly don't tell us about it. The greenies certainly don't tell us about it. They would rather just try and push the narrative that all these renewable energies are so good for the planet that stuff the people going through financial hardship, because it's putting our power bills up exponentially. And why this all matters, or why it matters to me, because the end-of-life cost and the processes are real. They're not imaginary. These things are happening. This is what the costs are going to be. If we don't budget for these, the burden will fall on the taxpayers, the consumers, or the landowners. And it's already doing that. But it will only get worse. We will only be having to pay so much more, because the life cycle impact, the embodied energy, the material supply, the recycling, the disposal, are part of the true cost of an energy technology. So we can't believe a word that His Honourable, dishonourable, Chris Bowen in our Parliament, the Energy Minister, we can't believe a word he tells us, because he doesn't tell us the entire truth. And neither do the LNP party when they're in power. They just want, well, one of our previous Prime Ministers had shares in renewables. So no wonder the narrative is getting pushed. So if we build a system thinking cheap to build, cheap to run, but we then ignore the expensive to retire, we're not being honest about long-term costs to society. And these renewables are not cheap to build and cheap to run, not at the moment. That's why our power bills are going up. And they're certainly not cheap when we retire. The consumers matter, we matter, but obviously not to the government, not to these energy companies. Now, as I said earlier, Bundaberg in sort of central Queensland, there's a company wanting to put a massive battery system that takes the residual solar power that everyone in the district's solar creates and store that. And then when these other renewables start to fail or can't keep up with the baseload power, this company will then sell that power, which means more to your bill, to those consumers who've already paid for the solar to cheapen their bills. They're now going to have to pay for that excess solar that they've created themselves with their systems and pump back into the grid. They're going to have to pay for that again. Now, it'll be an extra cost on their bill. So my remedy to that is most households that have put solar up should go and get their own storage battery. Just speak to people who have got batteries at their houses, connected up to their solar standalone batteries, and if they've got them set up right, they are saving a massive amount of money on power bills. That was just something for you to consider. I've looked into it myself. We're doing it at my son's place, so I know. Now, as I said, consumers matter, you matter, I matter, every struggling family matter, household, small business. They need reliable power at an affordable price. Now, policies that leave them paying the cost of transition into transparency, without transparency, which is what we're getting, are not just economic issues, they're also moral issues. Rather than an abrupt switch to renewables, a wise energy policy might keep a strong base load, including coal where it's appropriate, while ramping up the renewables and building grid firming and recycling infrastructure in parallel with those systems. But we need transparency and accountability for that as well. We need full visibility on costs the whole way through, not just the dribs and the drabs that the government is feeding us, just trying and keep us placated. We need to know everything. We need to know how much we're going to be told to bend over and pay these bills in the future. We need full visibility on costs, on the generation, the transmission, the firming, the disposal. If we don't show the full life cycle from construction to retiring, they're misleading us. We need to know. Now, many rural and regional communities depend on coal mining, and coal generation employment. An abrupt removal of that base without alternative economic strategies will also damage communities. We're seeing mines shut down. We're seeing towns in Queensland, all over Australia, just withering to such a small population because the greenies and the government are shutting down the coal mining and the coal power stations. Now, of course, we need to keep on with the environmental stewardship. We must care for the planet, but we must not be lied to about it. That the net zero and the renewables are not cost-free miracles that Chris Bowen and the Greenies try to make out, and Anthony Albanese they try and make out. They come with labour, with replaced technologies, disposal challenges, and materials use, rare earth materials that they're saying that we can't use, but we'll either sell them overseas so they can make them into things that are going to cost us even more. Recognising that doesn't mean rejecting renewables altogether. It just means planning properly. And this push for net zero, this push for renewables so fast, it hasn't been planned properly. But we also have a long-term responsibility. If a solar farm is built today, we need to ask, who pays to dismantle and recycle it 25 years from now? If a wind farm's built, what happens to composite blades when they're retired? The responsible answer means upfront planning and cost internalisation. So I want to bring a call to action now with every single one of you, because I guarantee most of you are struggling with power bills and with cost of living. I know I am. On a side note, my wife and I were paying rent. The rent kept going up. We're now living in a caravan because we can't afford the rent now, on top of the power bills and everything like that. So we're living off grid in a caravan. Now, the promise of renewables will lower your power bill quickly is overly simplistic. Not only that, it's a lie. Real world bills are rising in many cases because the system has to bear transmission, firming and life cycle costs. And we're paying for every cent of that. The coal-fired baseload still has a strong argument in terms of reliability, cost and stability, especially in short to medium term usage. And the life cycle of renewables, the construction, the operation, the decommissioning, has hidden costs and risks that Chris Bowen and Albo don't want to tell you about. None of these companies, or these governments, that are pushing these renewables, they don't want to tell you about all of that extra expense that you're going to have to pay. We need transparent planning. Now, Australians deserve an energy transition that is fair, is affordable, is reliable, and respects communities, workers, and households, especially those in the regions. As a community, and if you're a Christian, as a church, as a church body, we should be engaging in this conversation. How do we ensure the vulnerable among us aren't left behind? And they are being left behind, people. I'm seeing that on the streets. I'm seeing families having to live on the streets because of this cost of living. And this power price rises are a major contributor to that. How do we steward our resources wisely? How do we care for creation without neglecting human livelihoods and way of life? So here's what I invite you all to do. Go and ask questions of your local representatives, local members of parliament, state, federal. Ask your electricity retailer or community network about how power bills are being driven, what all these extra costs are that are putting your power bill up, and support policy that values reliability. Support politicians who bring in transparent and intelligent policy that's not going to make every Australian suffer. Now, because we all have a long-term responsibility, not just short-term slogans like the politicians have. And in your own home, experiment with ways to reduce the demand on your power, to increase efficiency. Like I said, if you've got solar on your roof, put a battery in. Ask your landlord if they can put a battery in, because it will be for their benefit in the future. And prepare for the fact that power pricing is going to be a key social issue of our time, of our generations. So that just gives you a few things to think about today about the cost of power, how it's going to go up if we, the people, don't do something about it. We need to go and get our own batteries and show these power companies, these politicians, that we're not going to put up with them forcing money out of our pockets when we can do something to save that money. So everyone, thanks for joining me. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe and share this video so that more Australians can understand the full picture of what's happening with our energy system. If you have any questions, comments, or you want to dig into a specific aspect like recycling, solar panels, firming storage options, regional coal plant economics, or battery power, putting a battery into your own house, drop it in the comments below. God bless you all. I say that because I'm a Christian. This is just a news and information channel, but I'm a Christian. I'm a chaplain. So I say God bless you. And may you all walk with the wisdom, the compassion and integrity in the choices that we all make for our communities and for the future. Until next time, I'm Brian. This is Voice in the Wilderness. Hope to bring you another video soon. Bless you.